The Langston mansion stood at the edge of the city like a silent monument of success. Every corner of the house looked perfect. Gleaming floors, shining chandeliers, and servants moving quietly as if afraid to disturb the air itself. It was a place where nothing ever seemed out of order, a world built on rules and routine. The owner of this grand house, Edward Langston, liked it that way. He was a man who believed in discipline more than comfort, in silence more than noise, and in control more than emotion. Edward was a millionaire who had earned his wealth through hard work and sharp business sense. People respected him, even feared him, but few ever saw him smile. His days were filled with meetings, reports, and deals. Everything he owned, from his gold watch to his black car, reflected his love for precision. Yet behind all that success, there was something missing. Something no amount of money could fill. That emptiness lived quietly in the heart of his home, his son Noah. Noah was 7 years old, a small boy with light brown hair and a calm face. He had been blind since birth. Doctors had told Edward long ago that his son would never see the world. Edward accepted it with a straight face, but inside he carried a pain he never spoke about. He wanted his son to be strong, to learn to survive without pity. So he built walls around him, not real ones, but invisible ones made of strict schedules and silent expectations. Every morning, Noah was guided to the dining room by one of the staff. He would sit quietly at the long table while his father read the newspaper in silence. Sometimes Noah would ask small questions like, "Father, what color is the sky today?" But Edward rarely answered. He thought words of comfort would make the boy weak. He believed strength was born from silence. The mansion, though full of life, felt cold. The ticking of the clock was the loudest sound most days. The servants spoke in whispers and laughter was rare. Yet among them was one person who still carried warmth in her heart. Clara, the young maid. Clara had joined the household only 6 months ago. She was cheerful, kind, and always humming softly while she worked. She had a natural affection for Noah, who seemed to feel her presence even before she spoke. When Clara entered a room, Noah would smile, as if her kindness had a sound of its own. Unlike the others, Clara didn't treat Noah like a fragile thing. She talked to him like any other child. She described the world to him in colors and textures. "The curtains are cream," she would say softly. "They move like waves when the wind blows," or, "The sun feels golden on your hands today." These simple words painted pictures in Noah's mind, pictures brighter than anything his eyes could ever see. Edward often noticed this from a distance. He did not scold Clara, but he didn't approve either. In his mind, servants were meant to clean, cook, and serve, not to get attached. He feared kindness might make his son too soft. Yet he couldn't deny that Noah seemed happier when Clara was around. There was a faint glow on his son's face, a life he hadn't seen in years. Clara, however, noticed something Edward never did: the way Noah's fingers tapped against the table whenever he heard music from the radio or the faint tune of the clock chime. It was as if rhythm lived inside him. When she cleaned the piano room, she sometimes found Noah sitting quietly near the instrument, his hands resting on the edge, feeling its smooth surface. Though he couldn't see the keys, he seemed to sense their magic. One day, Clara whispered, "Would you like to know what it feels like to play the piano?" Noah nodded eagerly, a small smile appearing on his lips. But Clara hesitated. She knew Edward would never allow it. The piano was not just a piece of furniture, it was a memory. Edward's late wife, Amelia, had once played it every evening, filling the house with gentle tunes. Since her passing, the piano had remained untouched, like a sacred object. Still, something in Clara couldn't stay quiet. She saw how lonely Noah was, how badly he wanted to connect with the world. She thought music might be the bridge he needed. For now, she said nothing. But that day, when she watched Noah's fingers move gently in the air, she felt a spark of an idea forming in her heart, an idea that would soon change all their lives. Meanwhile, Edward carried on with his rigid schedule. To him, the house ran like a business, efficient and emotionless. But he didn't realize how the quiet that surrounded him was not peace but emptiness. He often looked at his son and saw not the boy he loved, but the reminder of a world that didn't go as planned. Noah, on the other hand, lived in that quiet world with imagination as his only light. He didn't hate his father. He just didn't understand him. To Noah, sound was everything. The click of shoes on marble floors, the soft sweep of a broom, the rustle of leaves outside. They were his colors, his sunrise and sunset. Every night before bed, Clara would tell him short stories in whispers, stories about rainbows, rivers, and music, and when she left, Noah would trace invisible piano keys in the air before falling asleep, dreaming of a sound he had never played but somehow already knew. In that mansion of perfection, where everything seemed flawless, no one could see that perfection had trapped love behind locked doors. But beneath that silence, something beautiful was waiting to be born. Something that would soon break every rule Edward Langston had ever made. The afternoon sun poured gently through the tall windows of the Langston mansion, painting soft golden patterns on the marble floor. Outside, birds sang faintly, their voices barely touching the quiet air inside. The house, as always, was silent. The only sounds were the steady ticking of the grandfather clock and the faint clinking of silver trays from the kitchen. Noah sat on the edge of the couch, his small hands folded in his lap, listening. For most people, silence felt empty. But for Noah, it was full of life. He could hear everything. The whisper of curtains swaying, the footsteps of maids passing by, even the low hum of the refrigerator in the distance. To him, every sound had a story. Yet in all those sounds, there was something missing. Something his heart longed for but didn't know how to name. Clara entered the room quietly, her soft shoes barely touching the carpet. She carried a tray with a glass of milk and a slice of cake, but her eyes wandered toward the grand piano that stood near the window. It had been silent for years, covered with a fine layer of dust, its keys untouched since Mrs. Langston's death. Clara often wondered what melodies had once filled this house when Edward's wife was alive. Perhaps laughter followed those notes, perhaps peace. Noah turned his head toward the sound of her footsteps. "Clara," he said softly. "Yes, dear," she replied, setting the tray on the table. "Are the birds singing today?" She smiled, touched by his question. "Yes, they are. I think they sound happy today. I wish I could see them," he murmured. "You can," she said gently. "You just have to listen harder. When you listen with your heart, you see things differently." Noah smiled faintly. He liked the way Clara spoke. Her voice carried warmth, not pity. As Clara began to tidy up the room, her eyes fell again on the piano. She hesitated, then slowly lifted the cover from the keys. The ivory gleamed under the sunlight. She ran her fingers softly across them, creating a faint, hesitant sound. Just one note, but it filled the room like a breath after years of holding it in. Noah's head lifted instantly. "What was that?" Clara froze. "That? Oh, that was nothing. Just the piano. It's beautiful," Noah said eagerly. "Can you do it again?" Clara's heart skipped. She looked toward the hallway, half expecting Edward to appear. But the house was quiet. Carefully, she pressed another key, a lower one this time. The sound vibrated softly through the air. Noah's face lit up. "It sounds like the wind, but stronger." Clara laughed quietly. "You're right. It's music, Noah. Would you like to hear more?" "Yes," he said at once, almost whispering in excitement. So Clara sat on the piano bench and began to play a simple tune she remembered from childhood, a lullaby her mother used to hum. The notes floated like light bubbles in the air, touching every corner of the room. Noah sat motionless, his head tilted slightly upward, his lips parted in wonder. For the first time, he didn't just hear sound, he felt it. The vibrations from the piano seemed to travel through the floor, up his legs and into his heart. When Clara finished, the room fell silent again. But it wasn't an empty silence anymore. It was full, alive with the memory of music. "Clara," Noah whispered, "it feels like colors." "What do you mean?" she asked, intrigued. "When you play the high notes, I see yellow. When you play the low ones, I see blue. And in the middle, I see something like green." Clara felt a lump in her throat. She hadn't expected that. "That's beautiful, Noah," she said softly. "Maybe that's how your heart paints." From that moment, something changed between them. Every day, when Edward left for work, Clara would finish her chores quickly and then sneak into the piano room with Noah. She taught him where the middle key was, how to find it by touch, how to tell the difference between soft and strong notes. His small fingers trembled at first, unsure, but soon began to find their way. At times he made mistakes and frowned, but Clara would laugh gently and say, "Music doesn't come from perfect notes, it comes from a brave heart." And he would smile again and try once more. Their lessons were short and secret, like little stolen treasures. They had to be careful. If Edward ever found out, he would be furious. To him, the piano was sacred, a memory of his late wife that no one should touch. Clara knew the risk, but each time she heard Noah play a little melody on his own, it felt worth it. Weeks passed. The house began to sound different. It was subtle at first, soft notes drifting through the halls, laughter echoing faintly. Even the other maids noticed. "There's music in the air again," one of them whispered. But no one dared to mention it to Mr. Langston. Noah grew more confident. He could now play a few short tunes by memory. He loved how each sound carried emotion, joy, sadness, calm. "When I play," he told Clara one day, "it feels like I can see what happiness looks like." Clara smiled, her eyes glistening. "And what does it look like?" He thought for a moment. "It looks like you smiling at me." Those words stayed in Clara's heart long after she put him to bed that night. She realized Noah wasn't just learning music. He was discovering light in a world that had always been dark for him. But not everything stays hidden forever. One afternoon, as she and Noah played a cheerful tune together, a sound echoed from the doorway, the sharp creak of a shoe on marble. Clara turned, her hands freezing over the keys. Standing in the doorway was Edward Langston, silent, watching. His eyes were cold and unreadable. The melody died instantly. Clara's heart pounded as Noah continued playing, unaware of his father's presence. That single moment, the fragile beauty of sound meeting the heavy weight of authority, hung in the air like a suspended note, uncertain where it would land, and in that silence, a storm began to form, one that would change their lives forever. The next morning the mansion felt heavier than usual. The piano room door stayed closed, and the sunlight that once danced across the floor now seemed dull and afraid to enter. Clara worked quietly, her heart still pounding from the moment she saw Mr. Langston standing in the doorway the day before. He hadn't said a word then, just turned away and disappeared down the hall. That silence frightened her more than anger would have. She waited the whole day for him to call her, to shout, or to dismiss her. But nothing happened. No warning, no punishment, only silence. Noah, unaware of what had happened, waited patiently for Clara that afternoon. When she didn't come, he sat near the piano, his hands resting on the keys, remembering her voice. "Music doesn't come from perfect notes, it comes from a brave heart," she had said. So he pressed one key gently, then another. The sound was uneven, but it was still music. It gave him courage. When Clara finally entered the room that evening, he turned his head toward her and smiled. "Clara, you came." She knelt beside him, forcing a smile. "Of course I did. But we have to be careful, Noah. Your father. He might not like this." "Why?" he asked innocently. "Doesn't he like music?" Clara hesitated. "He used to. A long time ago." Noah tilted his head. "Because of my mother?" Clara looked at him in surprise. "How did you know?" He shrugged softly. "I hear the way people stop talking when I ask about her. I think she played the piano too." Clara nodded slowly. "Yes, she did. She played beautifully. Maybe that's why your father finds it hard to listen now. It reminds him of her." Noah was silent for a while. Then in a small voice he said, "Maybe if I play, he'll remember her in a happy way again." Those words touched Clara deeply. She saw something in the boy that his father couldn't see. Courage mixed with kindness. She smiled faintly. "Then we'll keep practicing. But quietly, all right?" From that day on, the lessons became their secret. They found times when the house was still, when Edward was away at meetings or out for evening dinners. Clara would close the curtains, lower her voice, and sit beside Noah at the piano. "Remember," she whispered, "your hands must feel, not just move." Noah nodded, tracing the edges of the keys. His fingers were small and unsure, but they learned quickly. He could recognize notes by their sound now, naming them proudly when he hit the right one. Sometimes Clara would hum along, turning their secret practice into a gentle duet. Each day the music grew stronger. What began as single notes became melodies, simple ones at first, but full of feeling. Clara wrote down notes in Braille for him, tiny dots on paper that guided his memory. Noah practiced even when she wasn't there, letting his imagination shape the sound. The mansion began to change, though Edward didn't notice. The air no longer felt heavy. The silence was softer now, filled with a hidden rhythm. Sometimes when Edward returned from work, he thought he heard faint music lingering in the hallways, but he brushed it off as imagination. Clara, too, changed. Her days no longer felt like chores. The house wasn't just a place to work, it was a place of hope. Every note Noah played was like a secret message, a reminder that even in the quietest places beauty could survive. But keeping secrets wasn't easy. One afternoon, while Clara was teaching Noah a new song, a voice suddenly called from the hallway. "Clara!" She jumped, her fingers freezing. It was Mrs. Jenkins, the head housekeeper. "Yes?" Clara answered quickly, standing up. Mr. Langston asked for tea in his study now. Her heart sank. "I'll go right away," she said, glancing at Noah. "Keep practicing, but very softly." As she hurried down the hall, she passed Edward's study door. It was slightly open, and she could see him sitting at his desk, staring at an old framed photograph, his wife at the piano. His face was blank, but his eyes looked tired, as if he was fighting a war inside himself. When she entered, he didn't look up. "Clara," he said quietly, "do you know who played the piano yesterday?" Her throat tightened. "Yes, sir," she admitted softly. "Who?" She hesitated. "It was me, sir. I only wanted to clean it, and I may have pressed a few keys by accident." He finally looked at her then. His eyes were sharp, searching. For a moment she thought he knew the truth. But after a long silence, he simply nodded. "Be careful next time," he said. "That piano is personal." "Yes, sir," she whispered, bowing slightly before leaving. Her hands trembled as she returned to the piano room. Noah sensed it immediately. "Is he angry?" he asked. Clara shook her head, forcing a small smile. "No, not yet. But we'll have to be quieter. Very quiet." Noah's fingers brushed the keys again, this time pressing them so lightly that the notes sounded like whispers. "Like this?" he asked. She smiled. "Perfect." And so their secret world continued. Music played in shadows hidden between chores and footsteps. Each lesson grew bolder, yet quieter. Noah's confidence blossomed. He began to create small tunes of his own, and sometimes Clara just listened, amazed by how naturally the music flowed from him. One evening, as the sunset painted the room gold, Noah played a tune so gentle that Clara felt tears rise to her eyes. It was the same lullaby she had played the first day, the one that had awakened his hope. But now it sounded fuller, deeper. When the last note faded, Noah turned his head and said softly, "Clara, when I play, I can see light. Not real light, but something inside." She placed her hand on his shoulder. "That's your soul, Noah. You're seeing with your heart." Neither of them noticed the shadow passing by the door. Edward Langston had paused there for just a moment, listening to the faint music before walking away silently. For the first time in years, he didn't feel angry at the sound. He felt something else, something that frightened him even more. He felt hope. For several weeks, the Langston mansion lived in quiet magic. Every day when Mr. Langston left for work, music filled the halls like sunlight sneaking through curtains. It was never loud, never showy, just soft, heartfelt melodies that seemed to breathe life into the walls. The servants noticed the change but said nothing. They loved hearing Noah laugh again. Even Mrs. Jenkins, the strict housekeeper, sometimes paused in the hallway to listen, smiling secretly before continuing her duties. Clara and Noah's secret grew stronger with each note. Noah could now play entire songs from memory. His fingers danced with confidence and his smile had returned, bright and alive. The piano, once a cold relic, had become his voice. It was the first time he felt truly free in his father's mansion. But secrets have a way of revealing themselves when hearts grow careless. And one cloudy afternoon, everything changed. That day began like any other. Edward Langston had left early for a business meeting in the city. Clara and Noah hurried through their chores, eager to begin their lesson. The rain had started outside, soft and rhythmic, tapping against the windows. "It's like the sky is keeping beat for us," Clara said with a laugh. Noah grinned, ready to play. They started with scales, then moved to a simple melody Clara had written for him. A tune that sounded like laughter mixed with rain. Noah played beautifully, his small hands moving with grace. Clara couldn't help but hum along. For a few perfect minutes, the mansion was alive again, not with order or rules, but with joy. But fate, as always, loves timing. But fate, as always, loves timing. Edward Langston's meeting was cancelled due to the storm. Annoyed but practical, he decided to return home early. His car pulled into the driveway just as Noah's melody reached its peak. When he stepped inside, he froze. Music, not faint, not accidental. Music. His heartbeat quickened. The tune came from the grand piano, his late wife's piano, the one he had forbidden anyone to touch. Without removing his coat, he walked down the hall, his footsteps sharp against the marble. The music grew louder, clearer. It wasn't random, it was deliberate, emotional, full of feeling. Each note seemed to cut straight into his heart, awakening memories he had buried. He saw Amelia, his wife, smiling as she played, her laughter filling this very room. For a brief, painful moment, he felt warmth again. Then anger rose to drown it. He pushed open the door. Clara gasped, her fingers freezing mid-air. Noah kept playing, unaware of his father's presence. His head tilted slightly, lost in the melody. The sound of the final note faded into silence. "Clara?" Edward's voice was low and cold. "What is the meaning of this?" Clara stood quickly, her hands trembling. "Sir, please, you were teaching my son behind my back?" His tone sharpened like glass. Yes, sir," she whispered. "But please listen, he's talented, Edward raised a hand, stopping her. His jaw clenched, his eyes burning. "You think it's your place to decide what my son should or shouldn't do?" Clara's voice shook. "He needed something more than silence, sir. He needed hope." Noah finally turned toward the sound of his father's voice. "Father?" he said softly. "Did you hear me? I played for you." Edward's heart twisted. But instead of pride, fear spoke louder. Fear of losing control. Fear of facing the past. "Noah," he said, his voice stern. "You know the rules." Noah's smile faded. "I just wanted you to hear what I can do. Clara taught me. I can make music, Father. I can see things when I play." Edward's hand trembled slightly. "That's enough," he said. "Clara, pack your things. You're dismissed." The words fell like thunder. Clara's breath caught. "Please, sir, don't do this." I said enough!" Edward's voice roared through the room, echoing off the piano lid. "You were hired as a maid, not a teacher, not a savior. You will leave tonight." Noah reached out, desperate. "No, don't send her away." "Please, Father, she helped me see the world." But Edward turned away, unable to face the tears on his son's blind eyes. He walked out, slamming the door behind him. The rain outside grew heavier, as if the sky itself was mourning. Clara knelt beside Noah, her own tears falling. "I'm so sorry, my dear," she whispered. "I never meant to hurt you." Noah shook his head, clinging to her hand. "You didn't, you made me happy." That night, the mansion was quieter than it had ever been. Clara packed her few belongings in silence. The other servants whispered among themselves, afraid to speak too loudly. Before she left, she went to the piano room one last time. The lamp cast a soft glow across the keys. She touched them gently and smiled through her tears. She left something there, a small sheet of braille she had written for Noah. It contained one simple song, the lullaby they first played together. At the bottom she had written, "Keep playing. The world will always listen to your heart." Then she turned and walked away into the rain. Upstairs, Edward stood by the window, watching her go. His reflection in the glass looked like a stranger, cold, rigid, lonely. He told himself he had done the right thing. Rules were necessary, structure was safety. But deep down he knew he had just broken something he couldn't fix, the only thing that had made his son's world bright. Downstairs, Noah sat alone at the piano. His fingers rested on the keys, but no sound came. The house was silent again, the kind of silence that hurt. That night, for the first time in years, Edward Langston couldn't sleep. The memory of the melody, his wife's piano singing through his blind son's hands, echoed endlessly in his mind. And for the first time, he began to wonder if he had been wrong. The next morning, the mansion felt empty again. Not the kind of empty you could see, but the kind that pressed quietly against the heart. The soft hum of happiness that had once filled the halls was gone. No faint music drifted from the piano room. No quiet laughter echoed from behind the doors. Only silence remained, heavy and cold, wrapping the house like fog. Clara was gone. Her small room was cleaned out, the bed neatly folded, her apron hanging lifeless on the wall hook. No one dared to mention her name. The maids moved quietly, afraid that any whisper might anger Mr. Langston. Mrs. Jenkins gave orders in low tones, and even she seemed to have lost her usual confidence. Noah sat by the window, his small fingers tracing the raindrops on the glass. He didn't cry that morning. He didn't speak either. He just listened to nothing. The silence that used to be his companion now felt cruel. It reminded him that the one person who had made the world sound alive was gone. When Edward walked into the dining room, he found his son sitting there, untouched breakfast in front of him. "Eat, Noah," he said, his voice stern but not unkind. Noah didn't move. "I'm not hungry," Edward frowned. "You have to eat. You can't spend the day sitting like this." "Will Clara come back if I do?" Noah asked quietly. Edward froze. The knife in his hand clinked against the plate. "No, Noah, she won't be coming back." "Because you sent her away," the boy said, his tone soft, not accusing, just sad. "You took away the music." Edward sighed deeply, setting his utensils down. "Music isn't important right now. What's important is your future. You need strength, not songs." Noah tilted his head toward his father's voice. "But songs are strength, Father. When I play, I feel like I can see. Doesn't that matter?" The words hit Edward like a quiet blow. He opened his mouth to answer, but nothing came out. Instead, he just stood up and left the room, his footsteps echoing through the still house. Days passed, and the silence grew heavier. The piano, once alive under Noah's fingers, was now untouched again. Dust began to settle on the keys, dulling their shine. Sometimes at night, Noah would sneak into the piano room and sit there quietly, touching the keys but never pressing them. It felt wrong to play without Clara there to guide him. One evening, as the sun faded behind gray clouds, Mrs. Jenkins found him sitting at the piano alone. "Master Noah," she said gently, "you should be in bed." Noah didn't move. "It's too quiet," she sighed. "Yes, it is. Do you miss her too?" he asked. Mrs. Jenkins hesitated. "Yes," she admitted softly. "We all do. But sometimes good people have to leave so that others can learn how much they mattered." Noah frowned. "Then why doesn't Father bring her back if he knows?" She had no answer. She simply placed a comforting hand on his shoulder and whispered, "Your father's heart is like that piano, dear. Silent now, but maybe one day someone will make it play again." After she left, Noah reached into the small drawer under the piano lid. His fingers brushed against a piece of paper, the one Clara had left behind. The braille dots were slightly raised, gentle under his fingertips. He traced them slowly and recognized the song, the lullaby. He hesitated, then pressed one key. The sound was soft, unsure. Then another, and another. Soon the familiar tune filled the room, faint but full of feeling. His voice trembled as he hummed along, remembering Clara's warmth, her words, her laughter. Upstairs, Edward paused in his study. The sound reached him faintly through the walls. His first instinct was to stand and stop it, but he didn't move. He listened. Something stirred in him. Memories he had buried for years. He remembered Amelia's laughter when she played, the way her hands had moved gracefully across the keys, the way their home had once been full of light. The melody echoed those days, soft, imperfect, but alive. For a long time, Edward stood by the window, staring into the rain. The sound of Noah's music filled the air like a whisper from the past. He felt tears form, though he blinked them away before they could fall. He couldn't explain it, but the silence that once gave him control now felt suffocating. The next morning, Noah didn't play. He seemed quieter than ever, his face pale, his small shoulders slumped. He barely ate, barely spoke. When Edward left for work, he glanced at his son and hesitated at the door. There was something in Noah's stillness that frightened him. Not rebellion, but heartbreak. At the office, Edward couldn't focus. His mind kept drifting back to the sound of the piano, to Clara's voice, to Noah's laughter. By evening, he found himself driving aimlessly. Not home, not anywhere in particular. He stopped near the park where he and Amelia once used to walk. There, sitting in the car with the rain drumming on the windshield, he realized something painful. His son was growing up surrounded by walls he had built himself. When he returned home that night, the mansion was dark and silent again. He walked past the piano room and stopped. The moonlight streamed through the windows, lighting the keys faintly. He reached out and touched them, just as Noah did. The cold ivory under his fingers sent a shiver through him. For a moment he almost played, but his hands froze. He whispered to the empty room, "I'm sorry," and then quietly he left, closing the door behind him. The silence returned once more, thicker than before. But deep inside that silence, both father and son felt something stirring, a tiny ache of regret. and a faint spark of hope waiting for the right moment to rise again. The next few weeks passed like slow-moving shadows. The mansion, once filled with small sounds of life, now felt like a museum, beautiful but lifeless. The servants still moved quietly through the halls, but even their footsteps seemed softer, more careful, as if they didn't want to wake something sleeping beneath the silence. Noah had stopped playing completely. The piano that had once been his closest friend stood untouched, its keys collecting dust again. Every time he walked by it, he would reach out, lightly brushing the smooth surface with his fingers, but he never sat down. It hurt too much to play without Clara, Edward noticed, though he said nothing. He saw his son's empty smile, the way he sat alone by the window for hours listening to the world outside. Sometimes Noah would ask simple questions that pierced Edward's heart. "Father, what does sunlight look like on people's faces?" Or, "When you hear music, do you feel colors too?" Edward never knew how to answer. He had built his life around numbers, rules, and silence, things that made sense. But these questions? They made him feel things he didn't know how to explain. One night, long after everyone had gone to bed, Edward found himself wandering through the dark halls of the mansion. He ended up in front of the piano room without meaning to. The door was slightly open and moonlight spilled across the floor like a silver path. He stepped inside. The air smelled faintly of dust and rain. He stood by the piano, staring at it for a long time. It was the same piano his wife Amelia had played, the same one Clara had dared to touch, the same one that had brought his son to life again. For years he had avoided it, afraid of the memories it carried. But now something inside him whispered that maybe he had been wrong. He sat down slowly on the piano bench. His hands hovered above the keys, shaking slightly. For a long moment he couldn't move. Then, almost without thinking, he pressed one key. A single note rang through the quiet room, soft, pure, and lonely. It was enough to make his eyes sting. He pressed another, then another. The sound echoed faintly, wrapping around him like a memory. He closed his eyes, and in his mind he saw Amelia, smiling, her fingers dancing over the keys, her laughter filling the room. She had always said, "Music is how the heart speaks when words are too small." Edward took a deep breath. His chest felt heavy, full of regret. He realized in that silent room how much he had lost. Not just his wife, but the connection to his son. As he lifted the piano lid to close it, something caught his eye. A small piece of paper folded neatly and tucked beneath the edge. He pulled it out carefully. It was a sheet of Braille. He frowned, unfolding it gently. Though he couldn't read it, he recognized Clara's handwriting at the bottom. He called for Mrs. Jenkins. When she arrived, half asleep and confused, he handed her the paper. "Read this," he said quietly. She ran her fingers over the dots and then read aloud, her voice trembling slightly. "Keep playing, Noah. The world will always listen to your heart." Edward sat frozen. Those simple words broke something deep inside him. He thought about Clara, her kindness, her courage. She hadn't disobeyed him out of disrespect. She had done it out of love. She had given his son something money never could: joy, purpose, and hope. After Mrs. Jenkins left, Edward stayed there, staring at the note. He finally understood what Clara had seen all along. Noah didn't need pity or discipline, he needed freedom. He needed something beautiful to hold on to in his darkness. The next morning, Edward went to Noah's room. The boy was sitting on his bed, listening to the morning birds outside. "Noah," Edward said softly. His son turned his head toward the sound of his voice. "Good morning, Father." Edward hesitated, his voice unsteady. "Would you like to play the piano today?" Noah's face lit up for a brief second, then faded with confusion. "But you said I shouldn't." Edward knelt beside him, something he hadn't done in years. "I was wrong," he said simply. "Sometimes fathers make mistakes." Noah's lips trembled into a small, uncertain smile. "Can I really?" Edward nodded. "Yes, and maybe you could teach me a little too." The boy laughed softly, a sound Edward hadn't heard in weeks. Together, they went to the piano room. Edward helped guide Noah to the bench. The boy placed his fingers on the keys, nervous but excited. The first few notes were uneven, trembling. Then slowly a familiar melody began to form, the same lullaby Clara had taught him. Edward listened, his heart full. The notes filled the mansion again, gentle and full of light. He closed his eyes and felt something shift inside him, something heavy lifting after years of being buried. When the song ended, Noah turned toward his father. "Did I do well?" Edward swallowed hard, his voice thick. "You played beautifully, son. Your mother would have been proud." The room fell quiet again, but it was no longer the cold silence of before. It was peaceful, warm, alive. That night, after putting Noah to bed, Edward sat at his desk and opened a letter pad. For the first time in years, he wrote not for business, but from his heart. He addressed it simply, to Miss Clara Bennett. He hesitated, then began to write. "You taught my son what I could not. You gave him music, and through him, you've brought it back into my life. I owe you more than words can say. Please come home. We need you." He sealed the envelope, and as he did, he smiled faintly for the first time in a long while. The house that had once been silent was beginning to breathe again. The morning air was cool and bright when Edward Langston left the mansion, clutching the letter in his hand. For once, he wasn't heading to his office or a meeting. He didn't tell anyone where he was going. He only knew that he had to find her. The one person who had opened his son's world, who had taught him something he himself had forgotten, how to feel. He had spent the night thinking about her words. "Keep playing, Noah. The world will always listen to your heart." Those words had followed him through the dark, echoing softly like a song that wouldn't fade. By morning, he knew what he had to do. It took hours of searching through nearby towns and asking quiet questions at shops and cafes before he finally found her. Clara was working at a small corner cafe in the next town, wearing a plain apron, her hair tied neatly, her face calm but tired. She was wiping tables when she looked up and froze. "Mr. Langston," she said softly, disbelief in her voice. Edward nodded a little awkwardly, the letter still in his hand. "Miss Bennett," he said quietly, "may I speak with you for a moment?" The other workers glanced curiously, and Clara hesitated before leading him outside, where the air smelled faintly of coffee and fresh bread. They stood under the awning as a soft drizzle began to fall. "I wasn't expecting to ever see you again," Clara said gently, her voice careful. "Is Noah all right?" Edward looked down, his voice low. "He's not himself. He's quiet, withdrawn. The house feels empty again. The music stopped the day you left." He paused, taking a deep breath. "And I realized it wasn't just music that left, it was his happiness." Clara's eyes filled with emotion. "He was such a bright boy," she said. "He just needed someone to believe in him." Edward nodded slowly. "You believed in him when I didn't. I thought discipline was love. But I was wrong." He looked up, meeting her eyes. "You gave my son something I never could. You gave him hope, and you reminded me of something I had forgotten about life, about my wife, about myself." He handed her the letter. "I wrote this last night, but it says less than what I truly feel." Clara took it, her hands trembling slightly. She didn't open it, just held it to her chest. "Mr. Langston," she said softly, "I didn't teach him out of pity. I did it because I saw a light in him. I knew he could see the world in ways we never could." Edward nodded, his voice breaking slightly. "Would you come back? For Noah? For all of us?" There was a long pause. Clara looked down the street where people hurried by under umbrellas and then back at him. "Only if you truly want the music to return," she said quietly. Edward smiled faintly, his eyes soft for the first time in years. "I do," he said simply. "More than anything." "I do," he said simply. "More than anything." That evening, when Noah heard footsteps enter the piano room, he didn't pay much attention. He was sitting by the piano, running his fingers over the braille notes Clara had left him, humming softly to himself. Then he heard a familiar voice, gentle, warm, trembling with emotion. "Noah?" His head lifted instantly. He froze. "Clara?" Her laughter was quiet, but full of joy. "Yes, my dear." "It's me." Noah jumped up, his face glowing. "You came back." He reached forward and she took his hands, guiding them to her face so he could recognize her smile. "I knew you would," he whispered. Behind them, Edward stood silently, watching the scene unfold. He had thought of 100 things to say to Clara, but in that moment he realized none were needed. Seeing Noah's face light up again was enough. Clara looked at Edward, her eyes shining. "Thank you," she said softly. He nodded. "No, thank you." For a long moment, none of them spoke. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was warm, peaceful, alive. Then Clara turned back to Noah and said, "Shall we play something? Noah grinned. I remember the song you taught me. The one about the rain, Clara smiled. Then let's play it together. She sat beside him at the piano and Edward moved closer, resting his hands on the back of the chair. As the first notes began to fill the air, the room seemed to come alive again. The melody was soft and steady, like sunlight returning after a long storm. Noah played with confidence now, his fingers sure and graceful. Clara guided him only when needed, her touch gentle, her voice calm. Edward watched in awe. He hadn't noticed before how expressive his son's face became when he played, how his eyebrows moved with emotion, how his lips curved slightly with each change in tone. The house that had once felt like a prison now felt like home again. The servants stood quietly in the hallway listening, tears in their eyes. Even Mrs. Jenkins wiped her glasses, pretending it was just dust. When the song ended, Noah turned toward his father. Did you like it? Edward smiled, his voice thick with emotion. It was beautiful, I think. Your mother would have loved it too. Noah nodded softly. I felt her while I was playing. Clara placed a hand over his. That's what music does, Noah. It brings back the people we love. Edward looked at both of them, his son and the woman who had changed everything. From now on, he said gently, there will always be music in this house. No more silence. That night, after everyone went to bed, Edward stood alone in the piano room. The air still carried the warmth of the melody they had played together. He touched the piano lid gently, smiling to himself. He whispered into the quiet, Thank you, Amelia. And thank you, Clara. And for the first time in years, Edward Langston didn't feel alone. Months passed and the Langston mansion was no longer silent. Every morning began with the soft sound of piano keys echoing through the halls, followed by laughter and conversation that once seemed impossible in that grand, quiet home. The servants moved freely now, smiling as they worked, and even Edward Langston had begun to change. His stern voice had softened, his frown replaced by thoughtful calm. Clara had become more than a maid. She was part of the family now, Noah's teacher, friend, and the light that had returned music to their lives. Together, she and Edward built a new routine for Noah. The boy spent hours learning melodies, his fingers dancing across the keys like a language only his heart could speak. He was growing confident, graceful, and more alive than ever. Then one morning an idea came to Edward, something bold, something that would show the world what his son was capable of. He called Clara into his study. I've been thinking, he said, looking up from his desk. Noah should perform. Not just for us, and for others too. Clara blinked in surprise. Perform? In public? Edward nodded. He's ready. The world should see what I once refused to see, that he's extraordinary. Clara smiled, touched. He'll be nervous. He'll be brave, Edward said softly. He always has been. And so the plan began. Edward arranged a small evening concert at the mansion. He invited close friends, business partners, and neighbors. He told them it would be a private recital, featuring a very special pianist. Noah didn't know until the night of the event. When Clara told him, his hands trembled slightly. They'll all be watching me? He asked. Yes, she said gently. But you won't be playing for them, Noah. You'll be playing for yourself. And for your mother. He smiled faintly. And for you too, Clara. She laughed softly. Then play with your heart, my dear. That's all anyone needs to hear. That evening, the mansion glowed with golden light. Guests arrived dressed in their finest clothes, murmuring with curiosity about the mysterious performer. The grand piano stood at the center of the hall, polished until it shone like glass. Candles flickered gently along the walls, and the air smelled faintly of roses and wax. Edward greeted the guests with quiet pride. He looked calm, but inside his heart raced. He had never been this nervous before, not even in business. This was different. This was his son. Clara guided Noah into the room, his small hand resting in hers. The guests fell silent as they saw him. A young boy in a simple suit, dark glasses hiding his eyes, but his face peaceful and full of quiet confidence. Edward stepped forward. Thank you all for coming, he began. Tonight's performance is special. It's not about perfection. It's about courage, love, and the sound of hope. He turned to Noah. Everyone, this is my son. A gentle murmur spread through the audience. Some smiled warmly. Others whispered in surprise. Noah felt their presence but focused on Clara's voice beside him. Sit down, she whispered. Breathe. And remember, every note you play is a story. He nodded, sat on the bench, and placed his fingers on the keys. The room was utterly silent. Then the first note rang out, soft, pure, and steady. The melody began slowly, tenderly, like a voice learning to speak. The song was one Clara had taught him long ago, the same lullaby that had awakened the music inside him. With each note, Noah's confidence grew. His fingers flowed across the piano as though they had their own life. The audience leaned forward, mesmerized. The sound wasn't perfect, but it was alive. Every note carried emotion, warmth, sadness, love, and light. Edward stood at the back of the room, his eyes glistening. He saw his son, not as a boy to be protected, but as a soul shining brighter than anyone else there. He realized that the blindness that once seemed like a curse had become a gift. Noah didn't play from sight. He played from something deeper, something pure. Clara stood nearby, her hands clasped together, tears quietly falling as she watched the miracle she had helped create. As the final notes of the song faded, there was a moment of silence, a deep, heavy silence full of awe. Then suddenly the entire room erupted into applause. People stood clapping and cheering. Some even cried. Edward walked forward, his heart pounding. He placed a hand on Noah's shoulder, his voice trembling. "You've shown me what vision truly means, my son." Noah smiled, turning his face toward his father. "Did I play well?" Edward's eyes softened. "You didn't just play well, Noah, you made the world listen." The applause continued. Clara wiped her tears and whispered to herself, "He did it." Later that night, when the guests had gone and the candles had burned low, the three of them sat together in the quiet room. The piano stood between them, glowing faintly in the moonlight. Edward looked at Clara. "I'll never forget what you've done for him, for us." Clara shook her head. "It wasn't me, sir. It was Noah's heart. I just helped him find the music that was already there." Noah reached out his hand, finding both of theirs. "We did it together," he said softly. They sat there for a long time, holding hands in silence. But it was not the silence of loneliness anymore. It was the silence of peace, of gratitude, of love that needed no words. Outside, the wind carried faint echoes of music from the open window. The same melody Noah had played, still lingering in the night air. And for the first time, the Langston mansion truly felt alive, because this time the music had come not just from the piano, but from three hearts finally beating in harmony. Finally beating in harmony.